Okay, we speak about lung water, and I first disclose the following conflicts of interest. I was a bit surprised to read this review that you likely read also in the JAMA a few just weeks ago, that stated that despite being an area of intensive research, to date no biomarkers are sufficiently informative to include them in a definition of ERDS. More direct and reproducible methods of measuring pulmonary vascular permeability and extravascular lung water are needed. What I will try to show you during the next 15 minutes is that, yes, it is possible to measure lung water. These are not biochemical biomarkers, but it is possible with some hemodynamic monitoring devices. And I'm pretty sure that you know these devices, these transpulmonary thermodilation devices, that actually are the only way to assess extravascular lung water at the bedside. With these devices, you just need a central venous catheter, with a standard venous catheter in the superior vena cava territory, and you need a femoral arterial catheter, which is a specific catheter with a thermistance at its tip. And the principle is that when you inject a cold bolus of saline in the circulation, at the other side of the circulation, that's why it's called transpulmonary thermodilation, you record the drift in temperature of the blood that is created by the injection at the other side of the circulation. And the principle is that the analysis of the curve and of its logarithmic transformation provides you an estimation of various intrathoracic volumes, including the extravascular lung water, which is the volume of lung edema. So, again, it's the only technique that is available today, and so likely the first argument for telling us why we should measure lung water is to know that transpulmonary thermodilation is the only technique that allows the estimation of lung water at the bedside. For many years, one must say that the question was, is it reliable? But I think that today we have some studies that should convince us that this estimation is actually reliable. I will show you just 4 arguments. First, we have this study, the Japanese study, that compared the estimation of lung water by the Picker device and the lung water measured by the reference technique that is gravimetry. I don't know if you know what is gravimetry. To measure lung water, you take the lungs, you weight the lungs, then you dry the lungs in an oven, and then you weight the lungs again, and the difference in weight corresponds to the volume of lung water. You understand why? It was an autopsy study. And they actually showed that there was a very close correlation between the lung water estimated and the lung water actually measured by the reference technique. I think it's one of the arguments validated in humans. Second, you could find some studies like this one showing that this amount of lung water is a predictor of mortality. For instance, in the largest study is the one we conducted a few years ago with Mathieu Josviac and Jean-Louis 200 ERDS patients, and we found that the volume of lung water, that the mortality was the highest in the patients with the highest volume of extravascular lung water. But even more, in these 200 patients, we showed that at multivariate analysis, the level of lung water was an independent predictor of mortality, independently from the other severity. How did we interpret this study? Not to say that you need transpulmonary thermodilation to know whether your patient is going to die or not, but rather that it wouldn't be possible to show that lung water predicts mortality independently if the estimation of lung water was totally rubbish. It's an indirect validation, we actually believe, of the estimation. Also, you can find such studies that show that the measurement is precise. For instance, here, we measured lung water after a bronchoalveolar lavage, because you know, during a lavage, you leave some fluid in the thorax, in the lungs. And we assessed whether it was possible to detect it with transpulmonary thermulation. And look, the technique was able to measure the small increase in lung water that was artificially created by the bronchoalveolar lavage, and also the natural resorption of the liquid is able to detect small changes. Not only small changes, but also rapid changes. In this other study with Martin Ress, we showed that lung water estimated by the PICO was able to detect the increase in lung water created by a weaning-induced cardiac dysfunction. And as you know, during weaning, if pulmonary edema occurs, it's over a few minutes only. And here the technique was able to detect this slight increase in lung water in these patients. Again, I think it would be totally impossible to show this if the measurement was totally senseless, was totally rubbish. A few arguments that I think tell us it is reasonable today to consider that lung water estimation by transpulmonary thermulation is reliable. Of course, it's not perfect. There are some limitations. It's not only lung water, but perhaps more importantly, it is lung permeability. Because these devices, I told you, estimate lung water, but also the volume of the pulmonary circulation, the pulmonary blood volume. And the devices simply calculate the ratio, which in fact is what's out of the vessels, what went out of the vessels, over what remained into the vessels. And so you see that it has something to do with pulmonary vascular permeability. It was suggested by some animal studies, and in a clinical study we showed that likely it's the case. We included patients with pulmonary edema, either cardiogenic pulmonary edema or ARDS, permeability pulmonary edema, and we showed that actually in ARDS patients, the pulmonary vascular permeability was higher than in the other ones. And even more, this PVPI value was able to discriminate between patients with ARDS and patients with hydrostatic pulmonary edema, suggesting that it might be helpful to diagnose exactly the cause of lung edema. And by the way, the sensitivity, the specificity of this permeability index for the diagnosis of ARDS was good, you see. It's always very reassuring. These results were confirmed later, but in a much larger population of patients in this Japanese study. So, again, we have arguments that today support that lung permeability, lung water, can be estimated by the technique at the bedside. How is it helpful? Perhaps for ARDS diagnosis. And here there is a very simple message. You will agree with me that the key lesion of ARDS, of the lung injury during ARDS, is diffuse alveolar damage. And you could find some studies that showed that the increase in fluid, the increase in the volume of the cells induced by diffuse alveolar damage can be estimated by the level of lung water. For instance, this is, again, a Japanese study. In a very high number, as you can see, of histopathological examinations. And you see that lung water was much higher in patients with diffuse alveolar damage. And more, even more, it was able to detect that with a good sensitivity and a good specificity. Importantly, it was much better than the PF ratio, because if we think about that, the PF ratio is a rough estimate of the diffuse alveolar damage, because it might be lowered, of course, by the true lesions of ARDS, but also by atelectasis. And so it's a less pure marker of the base of the typical lesion of ARDS. For instance, you could imagine a patient with ARDS with a PF ratio that is 110, but the lung water is 10, and another one with a much higher level of lung water, much higher diffuse alveolar damage lesions compared to the PF ratio that is the same. Just the problem of diffuse atelectasis. It's not only diffuse alveolar damage, but also the lung permeability, because basically, physiologically, you agree that the hallmark of ERDS is an increase in lung permeability. And so the direct measurement of lung permeability is likely something that might help you diagnose ERDS reliably, as it was claimed by Professor Schuster a few years ago. Okay, it reflects the primary injuries of ERDS, and the lung permeability is the, when it's increased, is the pathophysiological hallmark of ERDS. So if these devices are here, let's use them. Helpful for diagnosis, but perhaps more for treatment. Because you agree that there is a therapeutic conflict in ERDS, and we know that the problem is with fluid administration. Obviously, it's a therapeutic dilemma we have every day. The fluid I'm going to give can improve cardiac output, but in the same time, it might increase fluid overload and it might increase lung edema. How do we solve the conflict? How do we tilt the balance to the right direction? First, we should administer fluid only if we are sure that it will actually increase cardiac output. In other words, assess fluid responsiveness. Second, we should not give fluid if we are sure that it will not increase cardiac output. Assess fluid unresponsiveness, and these are the same tests that you might use. But also you should refrain from fluid administration if you know that the risk of increasing lung edema is very high. How do we assess the risk of this lung edema? Could it be with the central venous pressure or the PAOP? You know, some colleagues tell you, I stop fluid infusion when the PAOP reaches 18 millimeters of mercury, or if the CVP increases and so on. But the problem is that we must go back to the very basic physiology of the relationship between lung water and the pulmonary capillary pressure. It's this one. It's very obvious to understand that when we give fluid, we increase the hydrostatic pressure, and after the threshold, above the threshold, the lung water increases, there is a leak. But what's also obvious is that the degree of the leak basically depends on the lung permeability. All of us could receive 2 liters of fluid without lung edema. It's not the case for a severe ERDS patient. But what's also written on the slide is that a given level of pulmonary capillary pressure, so likely of PAOP, of CVP, doesn't tell you precisely the risk of the fluid you're going to administer. It's not PAOP, not CVP, perhaps lung ultrasound, and many colleagues today use lung ultrasound. Should it be helpful for this? In fact, no, because during ERDS what we need is a measurement of lung water that is quantitative, and with lung ultrasound it's very difficult to quantify the level of lung edema. You must count the B lines, and it's not that easy. And also, you have only the measurement of lung water in one point, and of course a hallmark of ERDS is that it might be totally different from one point to another. It's not cardiogenic pulmonary edema, so definitely lung ultrasound is not suitable. While for guiding the treatment, lung water and lung permeability might be helpful. It's very simple. Let's imagine this patient, day 2 of ERDS and community-acquired pneumonia. Blood pressure is low, but arterial pressure is low. And even more, you know that cardiac output increases with passive leg raising or fluid responsiveness tests. If you give fluid, cardiac output will increase. Do you give fluid to this patient or not? I'm sure that it's a daily question you know in these patients. Perhaps your question will not be the same if you know that lung water is slightly elevated, 12 for instance, and that the permeability index is slightly elevated, above 3, 4, or if you know that lung water is much more increased and the permeability index is very high. And in such a case, perhaps you would choose rather increasing the vasopressor rather than giving fluid to this patient. Might help you to solve the therapeutic dilemma. Years ago, it was tested in this study with ARDS patients. They were randomized between the monitoring of PAOP, conventional at that time, and the monitoring of lung water. And when clinicians looked at lung water, they gave less fluid, and the cumulative fluid balance was reduced, and this led to a decreased length of ICU stay and a decrease in the length of ventilation. It's a small study, should be confirmed, but something that again tells us that lung water and lung permeability estimated by the transpulmonary thermodynamic devices may help solve the therapeutic conflict of fluids in ARDS. Thank you very much for your attention.